The story I have for you today is a big one. It's about a news anchor whose sudden disappearance baffled her small town. Foul play is suspected immediately, but being a local celebrity proved to be almost a disadvantage to her case, because so often there are no suspects, but in this case, there are almost too many. And 28 years later, her mysterious disappearance still haunts the small town. This is the story of Jodi Huisentruit. On the morning of June 27, 1995, Amy Coons, an assistant producer at Kim TV in Mason City, Iowa, is deep in work mode, kind of losing track of the world around her. It's her job to map out the morning broadcast. In fact, she is so focused on her work that when she snaps out of it and looks at the clock, her stomach flips because she realizes it's already 4:10 a.m. And their morning news anchor, Jodi Huisentruit, hasn't shown up for her shift yet. At 4 a.m. it's actually late for Jodi, who's supposed to be there by 3 a.m. Amy rushes to give her a call. After a few rings, a groggy Jodi picks up the phone and explains she just overslept. She assures Amy she'll be at work in 10-20 minutes tops. It helps that she lives literally like 5 minutes down the road. Amy's not super worried about her making it in on time, as they've done this before. Except this time, that 20 minutes comes and goes, and Jodi never shows up to work. Amy has to go on air in her place, but she just has this nagging feeling that something's not right. Even though more and more coworkers are becoming concerned, they wait, hoping she'll come rushing in with an apology that she maybe accidentally fell back asleep, but no one's going to check on her. At 7 a.m., a Kim TV employee calls the Mason City Police and asks them to do a wellness check. Within minutes, police arrive at the key apartments where Jodi lives, and whenever they get to her car, what they see is that her red Mazda Miata is still parked in the parking lot, and it's hard to miss. But upon closer inspection, the scene around her car looks textbook, like there was a struggle. The contents of her purse are scattered on the ground, along with her red high heel. There's also a hairdryer, a bottle of hairspray, and the mirror on her car is bent backward, with the key to her car lying on the ground slightly bent, so it's looking like she was probably attacked getting into her car. To top it all off, they also notice what they call drag marks leading away from the car. There's not enough of them to indicate where exactly they go, like if she was taking somewhere on foot, or if she was maybe dragged into a vehicle. Looking at this scene, authorities are sure that 27-year-old Jodi has been abducted. They hit the ground running, shutting down the parking lot to process her car. On the exterior, they find a palm print, although exactly where on the car is unclear. And on the inside, they find some mystery fibers, maybe some hair. They're doing it just to be thorough, but you could even say the same for the palm print. There's no telling whose it is or when it got there, or whether it's related to her disappearance at all. The Key Apartments complex has 3 buildings and 2 parking lots for the residents. There is a river that runs behind one of the buildings and a campground that's catty-corner to that. So if she was taking somewhere on foot, there are actually a lot of places she could have been taken to. But there are no security cameras in the lot or on the buildings keeping an eye on things. We're in June of 1995 here, so things like security cameras in residential areas just weren't as common. Even though it appears that whatever happened to Jodi happened by her car, authorities still get access to her apartment to see if there's anything in there that will tell them anything at all. It's exactly what you might expect from a busy single woman living alone. A little cluttered, lots of clothes and work papers. But unlike her car, there are no obvious signs of a struggle in here. The one thing that does stand out is when they go in her bathroom, her toilet seat is up. Jodi lives alone, so this indicates to them that likely a man was in there at some point, but not necessarily that morning. They also found some used wine glasses on the counter, so it's possible she may have had company the night before, which could be why she overslept. One of the only other things they find in her apartment of real value, and it's not even that valuable, is her diary sitting on her nightstand. They're hoping something in there will give them something to work with. Maybe she had a boyfriend, or she was having trouble with someone at work, or her personal life. But unfortunately, the contents don't drop any bombshells. She just kind of talked about her life, a recent water ski trip, wanting more from her career. But all in all, the tone is really positive. With nothing in her apartment to give them a starting point, police begin to canvass her neighborhood and the surrounding area. But there's nothing in the complex, nothing in the river, nothing at the campgrounds. Truly nothing that they come across that helps. They even bring in search dogs to try and catch her scent, but they don't hit on anything, which makes them think Jodi was likely pulled into a vehicle of some kind. Talking to the neighbors didn't give them much to go on either. According to an article in the Star Tribune, a couple of neighbors heard a woman scream. Some even thought they heard someone say, "Leave me alone," and that would have been right around the time Jodi would have been heading to work. But no one seemed to have bothered to look out their window when they heard that, because there are no eyewitnesses to the abduction. The canvas is quickly becoming a bust until a man walks right up to police and tells them something kind of creepy. Now, exactly what he said has been quoted two ways, and they're varying levels of creepy. It's reported that one way he said this is he walked up and said, "I was the last person to see Jodi." But other places insist he said, "I was the last person to see Jodi alive," which has like a massively different connotation. This guy is John Vances. He has been living in Mason City for a while, and what he tells police is that he and Jodi are friends. His story goes that just the night before, sometime after 8 p.m., Jodi had actually come over to his place, and they watched a home video of a surprise birthday party that he had thrown for her 27th birthday a few weeks earlier. So he's like, they hung out, and then she left for the night, and that's the last time he saw her. When they start looking into John and asking around, some of Jodi's friends indicate to investigators that John wanted to be more than just friends with Jodi. They tell police that John is the successful older guy and Jodi liked the attention she got from him. He did well for himself, would treat her nicely, had some nice things. But the guy was like 49 and she was again 27, so she didn't see anything romantic ever happening between them. Police seem to think John's story is worth looking into, especially because when they start to establish Jodi's movements in the days and even hours leading up to her disappearance, his story is called into question. What police piece together is that the day before Jodi disappeared, she went to work and did the 6 a.m. news as usual. Then when she got off, she participated in the Mason City Chamber of Commerce golf tournament. Jodi was an avid golfer, so this outing was particularly appealing. She spends like a few hours golfing and then went home to change before this awards dinner at the country club that evening. And by all accounts, Jodi had a great night. Was in good spirits. She left around 8 p.m.-ish, telling one of the golfers that she had to head out because she had an early morning. The next thing police know for sure is that Jodi placed a call from her apartment to her friend Kelly at 8:24 p.m. Kelly wasn't actually home, but her husband spoke to Jodi for several minutes and says she didn't seem off. Wasn't panicked. Everything was okay, just sounded like she was calling to chat with a friend. So timeline-wise, if that call was made at 8:24, and she was planning to head to bed early so she could make it to work on time the next morning, then it doesn't really make sense that she would go to John's place, especially if she was going just to toss. Watch a video of a party they both were at. To be fair though, this was before social media. Maybe the video part isn't so weird, but there's something about the timeline that just doesn't seem solid. According to reporting by Josh Benson for the Find Jodi website, police have John come in for a polygraph. But regardless of the results, there's a lot about John's relationship with Jodi that rubs investigators the wrong way. The more they talk to her friends, the more they get the sense that his infatuation with her was bordering on obsession. He even named his boat after her. When Jodi's family eventually gets into town after she's missing, they meet up with him. The way he described his relationship with Jodi to them is like a father-daughter dynamic. Like he was looking out for her. But her family's kind of weirded out by him, especially when he says he liked watching her have fun. The other thing that stands out is he was also really weird about her car. She'd bought it relatively recently, and her friends say she was super proud of it. But one of John's friends named LaDonna remembers him telling her specifically about Jodi's car, and how it wasn't Jodi who had purchased it. It was a boyfriend who had purchased it, and she was planning on giving it back because she didn't want it. The problem with that whole story is that Jodi didn't have a boyfriend. When it comes to the morning Jodi disappeared, everyone's big question is, where was John? Well, he does have an alibi, sort of. That same friend of his, LaDonna, the one he told about the car, says she and John had this routine of walking in the mornings, and that morning wasn't any different. So she says John couldn't have abducted Jodi because of their walking routine. LaDonna says she called his home around 6 a.m. to confirm they were going to walk together that morning. And when she called, he picked up, agreed to still meet up. She thinks they're together by like 6. So what she's saying is that in her mind, he couldn't have done it because the timeline is so tight. She doesn't think he could have abducted Jodi a little after 4, taken her somewhere, and then made it back to his house by 6 for this phone call to tell, "Come in," unless the somewhere he took her was his house. But it's not like he says, "Oh, I can't walk this morning." They do end up meeting up. And then remember, he goes to the scene of the abduction afterwards to actually tell police he was the last one to see her. So if you did just abduct someone, and you had this short window, are you going to go on a walk and act like everything's fine? LaDonna says he wasn't acting any differently when they were together. It was like any other day. The timeline is tight, but it's not impossible. And a deeper look into John's past reveals he has had a few run-ins with the law. Though nothing violent. It's mostly just been arrest for drunk driving. He even had to install a breathalyzer in his car. But again, they don't have a whole lot else to go on. This guy's just got some weird stuff. And then he just makes things worse for himself when he starts doing these media interviews. Even though he's at the center of all this speculation and he knows it at the time, he's still willing to get in front of any camera at every opportunity he's allowed. Which means there are plenty of statements he makes to analyze. And the one that sticks out is that he sometimes refers to Jodi in the past tense. We're talking like even in the first few days of the investigation, he talks about how amazing she was, how much he cared for her. But other than these weird statements, other than the kind of unusual relationship, there's not anything connecting John to Jodi's abduction. Or at least none that they found. And it's hard to look deeper because they don't even have enough to get a search warrant. At this point, investigators are looking at him, but they're also trying to be really careful that they don't just get tunnel vision, and they're starting to understand they're in over their head. So that's when the FBI comes in to assist with the case. With their help, police conduct a search up to 2 miles on either side of the apartment complex, searching for anything that might point them in the right direction. But by the 30th, 3 days after Jodi disappeared, the search is called off. Meanwhile, word of her disappearance spreads like wildfire. In a twist of fate, the very station where she would regularly report the news was now breaking the disappearance of one of their own. This is a double-edged sword because on the one hand, getting the news out quickly can be the difference between life and death. But there's also the possibility that misinformation can spread very quickly. And that is exactly what happens. For instance, there's a rumor spread almost instantly that there was a bloody handprint found at the scene, which is just straight up not true. But somehow this gets reported over and over again. Eventually it does get cleared up, and thankfully doesn't do any catastrophic damage to the case. But it's little details like that that can make a huge difference. That being said, the media appeals do pay off because a guy named Randy Linderman contacts police and says he saw the news and remembers seeing something off in the parking lot of the Key Apartments on the morning Jodi disappeared. He said he was driving past to go to work himself and noticed a white van just sitting in the parking lot. At the time, that wasn't an immediate red flag on its own. But now, knowing what he knows, having seen the news, knowing Jodi was abducted around that time, he knew it had to be connected, and police agree. Talking with her friends and family in the first days of the investigation, police learned Jodi is extremely well liked in the community. So many people knew her because they saw her on TV every single day, and she would hang out at the same places they did after work. So to the people in Mason City, she was this tangible local celebrity. On the face of it, it sounds like she doesn't have any enemies. But on the other hand, she had plenty of admirers. And the attention was actually starting to worry her a little bit. Apparently, she had told friends she planned to take a self-defense class because once she noticed a truck had been following her during a run. And she even wanted to change her phone number because she was getting weird calls that scared her. 2 of the people she had golfed with the day before she was abducted said Jodi described the calls as just nasty and naughty. But she also said she wasn't overly worried. In her mind, this was just something that was part of being so well known in the community. She didn't want to keep getting them, so she was just going to change her number. It should be easy to narrow down who it could have been, who all had her number, right? Well, all of Mason City, Iowa had her number. Her information, phone number, and address was just straight up in the phone book. So anyone who was fixating on her could just call her up, or worse, show up at her place. For the mid-90s, it was completely normal to have all that information listed in a phone book directory, even if you were the local newswoman. But it would have made it super easy for someone to stalk her or wait for the right opportunity to take her. So the publicity on Jodi's case was garnering plenty of tips. More than 1,000 pour in over the next month, which keeps investigators busy, just tracking down leads. But for all the publicity, for all the tips, even the help from the FBI, the 800 people that are interviewed, none of it leads to any break in the case. It's hard to believe that with the number of tips and the number of people interviewed, they don't have any clear direction leading anywhere. This is where when these cases can get so overwhelming. Usually you can find the perpetrator right there in the first days of the investigation. Their name's somewhere in the case file. Sometimes, not always, especially when we're getting into genetic genealogy solves. But this is the downside to also getting 1,000 tips. The relevant stuff can sometimes get buried in the random stuff. Everything gets bogged down. Months start to pass and investigators don't make any real progress. Jodi's mom and sister even hire private investigators, but their investigation only yields theories, no actual evidence. In 1996, her case is featured on Unsolved Mysteries, but even the national attention yields next to nothing. Suddenly, what were weeks and months become years. And even in years, lack of tips isn't an issue. Tips come in all the time, but they're either dead ends or sometimes false leads altogether. So Jodi's case kind of stays in this limbo all the way until 1998. They finally get a lead that might actually go somewhere. An inmate at a Minnesota jail becomes a prime suspect through the most unusual way. A rap song? Police get a tip from a reporter who's looking into Jodi's abduction who says they should check out a man named Tony Dejuan Jackson. He had apparently confessed to a former jailmate that he had once abducted and killed an anchor woman. It's unclear if he said where it happened specifically, and the former jailmate may not have connected the dots right away. But when Tony wrote a rap song, some of the lyrics basically caught this guy's attention, and that's when he began to wonder if Tony actually had killed someone. When a reporter looks into this, they decide it's worth passing on to police. And when police hear the lyrics to this rap, they definitely want to dig a bit deeper. Here's a portion of that rap. She's a stiffin' around Tiffin, in a pile of silage in a bylaw, low below, off a highway by a gravel road now. Stiffin apparently refers to a dead body, and Tiffin refers to the city in Iowa of the same name. And that city happens to be just a few hours from Mason City. So again, nothing direct in this rap song, nothing direct alone in the confession. But it's the totality of the situation that makes police think it's worth talking to this guy. Plus, when they look at him, Tony's being held on the sexual assault of 4 women, all of whom share a similar build and physical characteristics that match Jodi. Though that obviously doesn't mean anything if he wasn't in the area. When they check, they find out Jackson was in the Mason City area around the time of Jodi's disappearance. More than even around, he was actually living like 2 blocks from the station Jodi worked at. And to top it all off, they learned this guy was actually interested in broadcasting. According to an episode of 48 Hours, he'd been a part of a couple of talk shows while enrolled in community college. So this kind of theory starts to form that maybe he'd been watching the news and had become obsessed with Jodi. Maybe he'd been following her and learned her schedule, where she lived, and when she usually left for work in the morning. So investigators go to interview him, hoping this is it, the break they've been waiting for. And Tony Jackson admits he was in the area. But he says it couldn't have been him because the day of Jodi's disappearance, apparently he had fallen down some stairs and spent several hours in a local hospital. So he said he couldn't have abducted her because he was on crutches. Now, this accident allegedly happened the night before she would have been abducted. So he's saying he was in the hospital that evening and would have been on crutches the morning when she's going missing. You would think the specifics would be easy to corroborate and should have been corroborated. But nothing can be found in the source material that says police confirmed or denied this story. If he's at the hospital, there should have been records that they sent him home. Someone would have seen him at the hospital wearing crutches. They don't explicitly say they contacted the hospital or whatever, but there's a tendency to think there might have been a little bit of a hole in his story, and it didn't fully check out. Or maybe they thought more people were connected or the injury wasn't bad enough. All else known is they don't just write off this lead there and then. Because in October of 1998, police locate this farm in Tiffin that they believe to be the same one mentioned in this rap. And they actually launch a full search of the property. During this search, they bring in cadaver dogs, and 2 of the 3 dogs signal that they smell human remains in this abandoned silo. But when they search the silo, they come up with nothing. No human remains are ever found related to this case in Tiffin. It is worth noting the search did turn up some red cloth, but nothing that could be definitively tied to Jodi or even anyone else for that matter. But even if everything seems fuzzy around him, there actually is One thing they have that could definitively rule him in or out more than this hospital crutch's alibi. And that is a hair found at the crime scene. Wait, a hair? Say, you're just now bringing up that a hair was found that wasn't hers. I know. And I promise I waited until now for good reason. And that is this is the first time police ever even admit to finding something at the scene. And this is around February of 1996. So they've said nothing. We knew about a palm print, TBD, whose that is. And then we hear about a hair in February of 1996. But then after February 1996, they seem to let it go. According to the Find Jodi podcast, which was created by the Find Jodi website team in connection with podcaster Scott Fuller, the location of the hair that was referenced in February 1996 was never disclosed. So whose hair it is and whether it even relates to the crime is unknown. Frank Santiago is the first to break this news about the hair for his article in the Des Moines Register. And then the Find Jodi podcast actually confirms this hair, that it's legit, but it was only ever mentioned publicly once. But when it was mentioned, it did come from investigators. So does Tony have similar hair to the one found? There's no idea because, again, they don't mention it after that. They don't talk about how long it is, what color it is, whether you can tell the race of the person from it. Nothing. But it's likely the hair is at least partially why, by May of 1999, investigators have cleared Tony as a suspect in Jodi's disappearance. Though that can't be said for sure because not enough is known about the hair. After this, 5 years pass and police are still basically where they were in June of 1995. So what happened to John Vances? It seemed like things with him just kind of fizzled out. He's always been on investigators' minds, but there's just nothing they have that they can use to link him to Jodi's disappearance. Or at least not in a concrete way. But clearly they were trying. Because back in 1997, they had even convened a grand jury in the hope that they'd be able to indict him specifically. But that grand jury confirmed they did not have enough, and he's not the only person of interest. According to an interview with investigator Frank Stearns for the Globe Gazette, he says, "I'm not saying he's out. I'm not saying 35 or 40 others are out. I'm not saying anything on him passing a polygraph. Is he still being looked at? Yeah, and so are several other people." The problem with Jodi's case isn't the lack of interest. By the year 2000, people are still dedicated to bringing her home. The problem here seems to be that there are too many possible persons of interest. I can't remember a case where 5 years later, people connected to it are saying there's up to maybe, 40 persons of interest? And to have 40 and not have any standouts. Anyone that you're really able to own in on, that's gotta be tough. Well, there actually are a couple of standouts among these 40. Or at least they stand out because they're the only ones that have had some reporting around them. For instance, there's a man who comes on police and the public's radar in the year 2000. His name is Dustin Honkin. He's from Mason City, and by 2000 he's serving a lengthy sentence for manufacturing and distributing methamphetamine and obstruction of justice. But he's also a suspect in 5 disappearances from back in 1993. The victims were his girlfriend's ex-boyfriend, a former colleague who had turned him in, and that colleague's girlfriend and her 2 kids. Now the difference between those disappearances and Jodi's are that in 2000, all of those 5 bodies are discovered. So in 2001, Dustin's charged with 5 murders, but the reason he gets brought up in connection to Jodi, honestly, seems like a stretch to say the least. He was definitely in Mason City at the time of her disappearance, as was his girlfriend, and this rumor started going around that Jodi somehow knew something. Maybe she'd reported on the disappearances, maybe she'd gotten into drugs herself. Her getting into drugs isn't a complete reach, because there's one interview from her coworker Amy, who said Jodi had been really up and down before she disappeared. And she said she wouldn't be surprised if drugs were involved in Jodi's mood changes, or behavior, or whatever. Oh, but there also could be any number of reasons for mood changes, and none of her other friends have ever come forward saying anything close to that. And as far as is known, nothing related to drugs in Jodi has ever been proven. But either way, whether she did or didn't use drugs, the rumor basically was that Dustin's girlfriend was supposedly working at the country club where Jodi's golf outing was the night before she died. So everyone's thinking that maybe this girlfriend heard Jodi talk about something like she was onto this guy for the disappearances. But the problem with that theory or rumor is that Jodi wasn't reporting on or investigating the disappearances that happened in 1993. She didn't do it at the 6 a.m. reporting. Not the noon reporting. Those just weren't stories she was covering. And even if she did cover them, no one had even known they'd been murdered by 1995. Their bodies hadn't been discovered. They were just disappearances. And it's never even been confirmed that Dustin's girlfriend was working at the country club the night Jodi was there. Can't confirm that she saw her, heard her say anything, whatever. But rumor and speculation swirl, especially in a small town. And despite investigators ruling out any possible connection, it takes a long time before the public catches up to that. Now, another case that often gets connected to Jodi's is the 2001 abduction of a 17-year-old girl named Anne Sluted, mostly because there are a few similarities. Like, for instance, Anne was attacked on her way to her car, and her personal items were discovered scattered near that very car. But unlike in Jodi's case, there were witnesses who saw a man approach Anne, strike her on the head, and drag her into a nearby minivan. And miraculously, 5 days after Anne's abduction, she was rescued, and her abductor, Anthony Zappa, was arrested. So you can see at first, especially to the public, it seemed like there could be a connection here. Even though they're in two different parts of the country with a 10-year age gap, the similarities regarding how they were abducted were striking to people, but not necessarily to investigators. And that's understandable. Being abducted as you're getting into your car is like one of those crimes of opportunity, or it presents the opportunity for someone. It's not necessarily a clear, defined mo. That's exactly what investigators are thinking, which is kind of why they downplay any of the similarities, and they move on. The next few years are full of more of the same. More persons of interest come on investigators' radars, but one by one, they're all ruled out. They also occasionally compare that palm print to their suspects or persons of interest, whoever. But it's not a match to anyone, and it's not just investigators looking for answers. Jodi's case still grips the public attention, which is why, when a news director from Minnesota named Gary Peterson gets a letter from a psychic offering to do a reading on any case he wants, he immediately thinks of Jodi's case. Now, he's not even expecting the psychic to come back with anything substantial. And in true form, it doesn't seem like anything substantial does come. Because although he gets a list of answers back, it doesn't seem like there's anything really reported on around it, or anything came of it. But because of this thing that Gary did, the station he works for actually runs a short piece on Jodi, which garners a ton of interest. So much so that Gary and another reporter named Josh Benson end up producing a 13-part series on Jodi's abduction. And the amount of attention it gets pushes Gary and Josh to dig even deeper. At some point, it becomes personal for them because they believe Jodi's case is solvable. So in 2003, they established FindJodi.com, which they say is basically a nonprofit dedicated to compiling research for Jodi's case in one place and presenting it to the public. They're not just collecting things, but doing their own original reporting and publishing all of that on the site too. Around mid-2020 is the time they start putting out episodes of their podcast, which, by the way, Scott Fuller has one of my favorite podcast voices ever. So not only is the information pretty compelling, if you've gotten sucked into this case, like I've been forever, but he's an easy listen. They kept putting out episodes until October 2022, and it was so helpful when putting together this episode. So I definitely recommend giving it a listen. In the episodes, they go through a ton of information, some of which has been known to the public for years. That's what I was saying. When they first started this adventure, they were like, let's just document what's out there, what we know. But then they started doing their own original reporting. And so you also get stuff on the site and on the podcast that has never been released before. I'm not going to go over every single point they make. Again, go listen yourself if you want all the nitty-gritty details. But here are the things that really stuck out to me. The first comes from when they interviewed a few people who lived in the apartment complex Jodi did. A couple of people mentioned seeing beer cans lined up in the complex parking lot, and that might not seem like an important detail, but based on where these cans were, and when they would find them, it looked to them like someone had just been sitting in the parking lot drinking beer all night. Because they would find them in the morning, and this was around the time of Jodi's disappearance, just a little bit before. But it's extra significant because if you sat or stood where the cans lined up, you could actually see into Jodi's apartment, like someone could have been sitting there watching her. They said it looked like they'd just been sitting there. But what if they were looking at something specific? What if it was Jodi? And the most important thing about this tip to me is that none of the witnesses remember seeing beer cans after Jodi's abduction, only before. It's unknown if police came and collected those cans or if this information was even given to police at the time. It was shared at some point, but whether it was during the initial investigation is unclear. It's also unknown if the cans were even still there on the morning of the abduction. So investigators at the time very well may not have had them on their radar. Those two witnesses weren't even the only ones who noticed something strange going on at the key apartments when Jodi disappeared. Another person who lived there tells the Find Jodi team that she remembers seeing what she describes as this creepy guy who was known to lurk around the area. And she says he lived in the campgrounds behind the apartments. A week before Jodi disappeared, she noticed him sitting in a gray car that was parked behind Jodi's apartment complex. So, not the parking lot she normally parked in, but she said this guy was just sitting there, not really doing anything, and she wasn't about to stay and watch him. She kind of just clocked it that he was there and moved on. But then once Jodi went missing, she doesn't remember seeing this guy again, which is super strange because he was clearly around enough for her to recognize him, even give her the creeps. So why once Jodi vanishes is he suddenly gone too? And then there's another woman who lived at the apartments who remembers seeing a green car that she didn't recognize sitting in the same parking lot before Jodi disappeared too. Now, I know that might seem like a detail that doesn't really matter. There are a million reasons someone could have been parked there. But I think in a case like Jodi's, every single detail counts. And it's worth noting that even though the colors of the car were different, both witnesses described them sitting in the same parking lot around the same time, just before she went missing. Eyewitness testimony is notoriously unreliable, so it honestly could have been the same car. They're just remembering it as different colors. And also the fact that this happened years ago, like 1995, and then we're getting this information on the Find Jodi podcast in 2020, so the chances of them misremembering something like the color is just higher with all the time in between. And who knows what time of day it was. If it's nighttime, there's also a world where they saw the same car, and someone is interpreting it as gray, someone's interpreting it as green because there's like no light. It's unknown if either of them went to the police with their stories. You'd imagine again, police canvassed, so that they would have tried to talk to them. But was this something that got lost in all of the other tips that were coming in? Now, before we totally wrap, I do want to go back to John Vances for just a minute, because he has remained a person of interest, and a lot of people still talk about him. And I can't really blame them because police are conducting searches of his vehicles within the last, like 6 years? Plus I keep coming back to whoever took Jodi knew her schedule. They knew she'd be going to her car at that time of the day, which is not your typical 7:45 leave for work time. The morning, they knew because they knew her, or they knew because they were watching her, or even just watching the news. I don't think one is more likely than another. In fact, maybe I'm overthinking it here, but with the totality of everything, the calls, the truck following her, beer cans, car spotted. I know I'm the outlier, but I think if John were involved, we would have more answers. And maybe this is so hard to solve because the answers are with someone who we don't even know about yet. Well, and I also keep coming back to those mystery calls. Wouldn't they have been able to trace them or something? At the top of the episode, you said they knew Jodi had made a call from her apartment the night before. So they got her phone records, right? Maybe, maybe not. I mean, it's very possible that friend's husband could have just said they were on the phone. But the reason I think it was some kind of record, the time is just so specific, like 8:24. Yeah, but I assume if they could get those records, maybe they would have gotten the other ones. But I don't know, maybe outgoing versus incoming was different back then? Or maybe the weird calls came from a payphone, so they don't actually know anything. Or again, maybe they know and the stuff is sealed that we can't see where the calls came from. I don't know. Or maybe they found out who it was and it didn't have anything to do with her abduction, which I guess would bring us back to John. I don't know. And the truth of the matter is we just don't know. But like you, everyone keeps coming back to John. And I will tell you the one thing that does give me full body chills about him. Amy Kunz, the assistant producer that called Jodi the morning of her disappearance, was interviewed by the Up and Vanish team in 2020. And according to that interview, Amy says she knows in her heart that John is guilty. And she alleges that around 7 a.m., the morning Jodi disappeared, she got a phone call at the station. And when she picked up, it was John Vances. And she says he asked if Jodi was at work. When Amy said no, that she never made it in, he pressed the issue asking, "Is she sick?" Why isn't she there? And Amy said that's weird because he had never called the station before. So why is he calling that morning of all days? Now, she also had a story that took place a couple of weeks after Jodi went missing. She said she saw John at a laundromat, and according to Amy, he came in with 2 garbage bags full of laundry and just like death stared her down. And she says she believes it was his intention to try and make her feel uncomfortable. And she's like, it totally worked. But that one, I think I can write off a little more than the other stuff. Because I think people were already looking at him by that time. And she worked in media. So I don't know what him staring at her could mean or did mean. Amy says she reported that incident to police and they sort of brushed her off. I wish I had police corroborating this report or another side, but we just don't. We just have a guy who clearly had an infatuation with Jodi, a kind of alibi, and some weird statements after the fact. And that is what makes Jodi's case so difficult to solve. There are really only a few facts we know for sure. We know Jodi was alive around 4 a.m. on the 27th and abducted as she was getting into her car shortly after her call with Amy. We know there was a white van spotted in the parking lot of her apartment complex, and that's literally it. Police have quite literally spoken to thousands of people, chased down even more leads, but that is still all the facts we have, and it's infuriating. And yet this case hits home to so many people because they felt like they knew Jodi. For a lot of people in the community, she was the first person to greet them in their living rooms each morning. So for her to go missing, it felt personal. Is there ever any word on whether investigators still have that hair from the crime scene? Nothing that I've seen. I mean, they can't even if they wanted to reprocess the car. And to be fair, again, I don't know that the hair was even found in the car. But so many years later, her car has different owners since 1995. So her family didn't keep it. No, they got it back shortly after Jodi's disappearance, and they didn't hold on to it. Actually, the Find Jodi team tracked it down in 2022, but by this point, any evidence that may still have been there is contaminated or destroyed. Plus, I don't think anything happened in her car. I think she was quickly taken away. Jodi dreamt of breaking into larger markets, and there's no doubt she would have moved on to bigger and better things given the chance. I mean, girl might have even been into podcasting one day. Until there is more proof about what happened, there will always be that wild grain of hope that maybe she is still alive. She'll be 55 today, and there are so many people still looking for her. So if you have any information about the disappearance of Jodi Huisentruit, please come forward. We've got all of the phone numbers and tip lines right in our show notes for you to make contact with police. And we've also put the information for the Find Jodi team.